On July 4th, 1954, the murder of Marilyn Sheppard made headlines in Cleveland. The victim's husband, Dr. Sam Sheppard, gave police this account of what happened.
I believe it was sometime after 12:30 a.m. that Marilyn tried to wake me. I had fallen asleep on the living room couch. I think she asked me to come up to bed. The next thing I knew, Marilyn was screaming or moaning my name. I jumped off the couch and ran upstairs. I thought I saw a white form standing in our bedroom. Then I think I was struck from behind and knocked out.
On a quiet summer night in 1954, inside a suburban Ohio home, a brutal murder would set off one of the most sensational and controversial cases in American history. In the early morning hours of July 4th, Marilyn Sheppard, the pregnant wife of respected neurosurgeon Dr. Sam Sheppard, was found beaten to death in her bedroom. The shocking crime immediately captured the attention of the nation, but it was not just the murder that fascinated the public. It was the man accused of committing it. Dr. Sam Sheppard was once viewed as a successful physician, a devoted husband, and a respected member of his community. But within weeks, that image was replaced by something far darker. A relentless media frenzy painted Sheppard as a cold-blooded killer before the evidence was ever fully examined. The trial would destroy his reputation, tear apart his family, and leave him fighting for years to prove his innocence. His name would become forever linked to one of the most infamous murder cases of the 20th century, a case that would later inspire the television series The Fugitive and continue to be debated decades after the verdict. But the story of Sam Sheppard did not end in a courtroom. After years of legal battles, personal struggles, and a life forever changed by the accusations against him, Sheppard found himself searching for a new beginning. That journey would take him somewhere almost impossible to imagine: the world of professional wrestling. Drawing upon his medical background and the notoriety that had followed him for years, Sheppard transformed himself and created a submission hold that would eventually find new life decades later in the hands of one of wrestling's biggest stars. It is a story filled with tragedy, controversy, redemption, and a bizarre twist of fate that sounds almost too unbelievable to be true. Born on December 29, 1923, Samuel Holmes Sheppard seemed destined for the kind of success that represented the American dream. Raised in a respected Ohio family, Sheppard was intelligent, athletic, and ambitious from an early age. At Cleveland Heights High School, he excelled academically while competing in football, basketball, and track. His leadership abilities were recognized by his peers, who elected him class president for 3 consecutive years. It was also during high school that Sheppard met the woman who would become his wife, Marilyn Reese. Their relationship began during a time when his future appeared limitless. Although several colleges offered him athletic scholarships, Sheppard chose a different path, following in the footsteps of his father and older brothers by pursuing a career in medicine. After marrying Marilyn on February 21, 1945 in Hollywood, California, Sheppard returned to Ohio and continued building the life he had always envisioned. He joined his father's medical practice at Bayview Hospital, where he established himself as a respected physician and member of the community. He had a successful career, a growing family, and the reputation of a man who seemed to have everything going for him. But behind the image of the perfect American family, tragedy was approaching. On the night of July 3, 1954, Sam and Marilyn Sheppard appeared to be living the picture-perfect American life they had built together. To celebrate Independence Day, the couple hosted friends at their lakefront home in Bay Village, Ohio, enjoying an evening of conversation, drinks, and entertainment with their guests. As the night came to an end, Sheppard later claimed that exhaustion from a long shift at the emergency room caught up with him. He fell asleep on a daybed in the living room, while he and Marilyn watched the film The Strange Holiday. According to Shepard, Marilyn walked the remaining guests out while he remained asleep downstairs. Then, sometime in the early morning hours, everything changed. Shepard said he was suddenly awakened by the sound of his wife's screams coming from upstairs. He rushed toward the bedroom, where he claimed he saw a strange figure standing over Marilyn, a white form bent over her barely conscious body. Before he could understand what was happening, Shepard said he was attacked and knocked unconscious. When he regained consciousness, Shepard claimed he heard movement coming from downstairs. He followed the sound and encountered what he described as an intruder, a tall man, around 6 feet tall, with bushy hair. Shepard said he chased the figure out of the house and toward the beach, where he was attacked again and lost consciousness. The next thing Shepard remembered was waking up partially submerged in the waters of Lake Erie, without his shirt. Confused and injured, he made his way back to the house, where he first checked on his 7-year-old son, Chip. Remarkably, the young boy had slept through the entire ordeal. At approximately 5:40 in the morning, Shepard called his neighbor, Dr. Spencer Houck, the mayor of Bay Village, to report what had happened. Police were not contacted until after Houck and his wife arrived at the Sheppard home and witnessed the scene themselves. Inside the bedroom, investigators found the horrifying sight. 30-year-old Marilyn Sheppard, who was 4 months pregnant, had suffered massive injuries to her head and was found lying on the bed. The brutality of the attack shocked the community, but investigators were immediately confronted with questions. There appeared to be no obvious signs of forced entry. The family dog had not alerted anyone during the attack, and a young child had somehow remained asleep throughout the violence. What happened inside the Sheppard home that night would become one of the most debated mysteries in American criminal history, and the first question investigators had to answer was one that would follow Sam Sheppard for the rest of his life. Was he a witness to a horrific crime, or was he the person responsible for it? In the days following Marilyn Sheppard's murder, investigators began focusing their attention on the man who had discovered her body. Sam Sheppard's refusal to sit down for police questioning only intensified suspicion. Sheppard maintained that he was following the advice of his physician, but that physician was also his older brother. To investigators and the public, his silence appeared suspicious. To Sheppard and his family, it was a decision made to protect himself during an investigation that was already becoming increasingly hostile. But the questions surrounding the murder were not the only thing making headlines. Within hours, details about Sheppard's personal life began appearing in newspapers alongside the gruesome details of Marilyn's death. It was revealed that Sam had been involved in an extramarital affair with Susan Hayes, a 24-year-old laboratory technician who worked at Bayview Hospital. The revelation transformed the case from a local tragedy into a national scandal, with newspapers portraying Sheppard not just as a suspect, but as a man whose character was already on trial. As public pressure mounted, the Cleveland press began demanding answers. 2 weeks after Marilyn's death, the newspaper published a front-page editorial calling for a public inquest into the murder. Responding to the growing pressure, Coroner Samuel Gerber ordered Sheppard and members of his family to appear at an inquest held inside a local high school. The hearing quickly became an event, with reporters filling the room and the public watching as Gerber questioned witnesses about Sheppard's marriage, his personality, and his alleged affair. Rather than simply determining the facts surrounding Marilyn's death, the proceedings became a public examination of Sam Sheppard himself. For 3 nights, the inquest unfolded before a captivated audience, blurring the line between an investigation and a public trial. By the time it ended, many people had already reached their own conclusions about Sam Sheppard's guilt. Just 1 week after the inquest concluded, the Cleveland press intensified its demands, calling for Sheppard to confess. Once again, public pressure influenced the course of events. Responding to the growing media attention, Gerber ordered Sheppard arrested and officially charged him with the murder of his wife. The trial of Sam Sheppard officially began on October 18, 1954, but by that point, the case had already become something much larger than a murder investigation. Because of the intense media coverage surrounding Marilyn Sheppard's death and her husband's arrest, the trial would go down as one of the most controversial proceedings in American legal history. Newspapers had spent months shaping public perception, and no publication played a larger role than Ohio's own Cleveland Press. The newspaper's relentless coverage placed enormous pressure on investigators and prosecutors, while also turning Sam Sheppard into a household name. Presiding over the case was 70-year-old Judge Edward Blythen, who was seeking re-election at the time. Critics later questioned whether political considerations influenced his handling of the trial, particularly his decision to allow extensive media access inside the courtroom. Reporters from around the nation packed the courtroom, including celebrity journalist Dorothy Kilgallen, who followed the proceedings closely in her national column. From the very first day, the trial became a spectacle. In court, prosecutors presented the jury with graphic photographs from Marilyn's autopsy. Sheppard requested to be excused during the presentation, but his request was denied, forcing him to remain as the images were shown. Then came what prosecutors believed was their strongest piece of evidence. Coroner Samuel Gerber claimed that a bloody imprint found on the bed resembled a surgical instrument with multiple points, something he argued only a doctor like Sheppard would have access to. But there was a major problem. The alleged murder weapon was never found. Furthermore, Sheppard's defense team was denied access to certain physical evidence, making it difficult for attorney William Corrigan to fully challenge Gerber's conclusions in front of the jury. As the prosecution's case moved toward its conclusion, they called their final witness, Susan Hayes, the young laboratory technician from Bayview Hospital. During the earlier inquest, Sheppard had denied having an affair with Hayes. Now, under oath, Hayes confirmed that the relationship had existed. The testimony devastated Sheppard. When he later took the stand in his own defense, the pressure became overwhelming, and he broke down while admitting to the affair. But the defense argued that there was another explanation for what happened inside the Sheppard home. Corrigan presented witnesses who claimed they had seen a man matching Sheppard's description of the attacker, a tall figure with bushy hair, near the area around the time of the murder. Despite the defense's attempts to introduce another possible suspect, the jury remained unconvinced. After 5 days of deliberation, Sam Sheppard was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury determined that the killing was not proven to be premeditated, sparing him from a first-degree murder conviction and a possible death sentence. Instead, Sheppard was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years. But for Sam Sheppard, the fight was far from over. The verdict would not end the controversy surrounding the case. In fact, it would only begin a decade-long battle over whether he had received a fair trial at all. The guilty verdict did not just destroy Sam Sheppard's life, it devastated everyone around him. Just 2 weeks after his conviction, Sheppard's mother, Ethel, ended her own life. 1 week later, his father, Dr. Richard Sheppard, died from complications caused by a bleeding ulcer. The family that had once represented everything Sam had built was suddenly gone. Despite the tragedy surrounding the family, Sheppard's brothers refused to give up. Determined to prove that the original investigation had been flawed, they hired renowned forensic scientist Dr. Paul Leland Kirk to re-examine the physical evidence from the murder scene. After analyzing the blood evidence at the crime scene, Kirk concluded that the killer would have likely been covered in blood due to the violent nature of the attack. However, Sheppard's clothing showed only one significant blood stain. Kirk also argued that certain blood patterns on the walls indicated the weapon had been swung in a way consistent with a left-handed attacker. There was one major problem for the prosecution. Sam Sheppard was right-handed. To the defense, this evidence suggested that the person responsible for Marilyn's murder may not have been Sheppard at all. but when attorney William Corrigan presented the findings and requested a new trial, the judge rejected the appeal. Corrigan refused to let the case die. He took the fight all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but the request for a retrial was denied. Then, in 1961, Corrigan passed away, leaving Shepard's future looking more uncertain than ever. With few options remaining, Sheppard considered taking a polygraph test in hopes of improving his chances for parole. That decision would bring a new person into the case, a young Boston defense attorney named F. Lee Bailey. Bailey became convinced that the real issue was not simply whether Sheppard was guilty, but whether he had ever received a fair trial in the first place. He argued that the intense media coverage, courtroom atmosphere, and actions surrounding the original proceedings had violated Sheppard's constitutional right to due process. Bailey took the case to the Supreme Court, and in 1966, the court ruled in Sheppard's favor, granting him a retrial. The second trial would take place under Judge Carl Weinman, whom Bailey later described as the best thing that happened to Sam Sheppard. As Weinman reviewed the original trial record, a shocking piece of information came to light. Dorothy Kilgallen, the nationally known journalist who had covered the first trial, revealed that Judge Blythen had allegedly told her before the proceedings even began that Sheppard was guilty as hell and that the trial was merely a formality. After reviewing the circumstances surrounding the original conviction, Judge Weinman determined that the media coverage surrounding the case had been so extreme that it had created an unfair environment. He described the press coverage as calculated to inflame and prejudice public opinion against Sheppard. After nearly a decade behind bars, the man who had become one of America's most infamous murder suspects finally walked free. On November 16, 1966, 40-year-old Sam Sheppard was released from prison. But freedom came with a price. He had lost 10 years of his life, his reputation was forever damaged, and he still faced the impossible task of rebuilding an identity after becoming one of the most controversial figures in America. And that search for a new identity would lead him somewhere no one could have predicted, inside the professional wrestling ring. Just 1 week after his release from prison, Sheppard married Adrienne Tabin-Johans, a German woman from Dusseldorf who had corresponded with him during his years behind bars. Although the marriage marked a new beginning, the controversy that had followed Sheppard for more than a decade refused to disappear. With his murder conviction overturned, Sheppard was able to regain his medical license and return to practicing medicine. It seemed for a brief moment that he might finally reclaim the career that had been taken from him. But fate had other plans. Following the deaths of 2 surgical patients, Sheppard became the target of malpractice lawsuits, and his medical career quickly unraveled once again. The setbacks proved overwhelming. His second marriage ended in divorce, and Sheppard struggled with depression and alcoholism. After spending years fighting to restore his reputation, he found himself searching for a new purpose. That purpose arrived from the unlikeliest of places. Sheppard eventually married Colleen Strickland, the daughter of professional wrestler George Strickland. During conversations with his father-in-law, Sheppard revealed that he had wrestled in high school, in college, and even while serving time in prison. George Strickland saw potential in the former neurosurgeon and agreed to train him for a professional wrestling career. At 45 years old, an age when most wrestlers are beginning to slow down, Sam Sheppard was preparing to make his debut. Performing under the name Killer Sam Sheppard, he entered professional wrestling in August 1969. The nickname capitalized on the notoriety that had made him one of the most recognizable men in America. Crowds packed arenas to see the infamous doctor, whose murder trial had dominated newspaper headlines for over a decade. When Sheppard announced his wrestling debut at a press conference in July 1969, the Cleveland press mocked the decision, treating it as another bizarre chapter in an already unbelievable life. But Sheppard ignored the criticism. "If I can't practice surgery," he reportedly told Strickland, "there's nothing I'd rather do than wrestle." And wrestle he did. Over the next 8 months, Shepard competed in roughly 200 matches across the United States, appearing before thousands of fans. According to George Strickland, he lost only one match and was already considering tours of Japan and Europe. For the first time since his release from prison, it appeared that Sam Sheppard had finally found a new purpose, but his redemption would be painfully short-lived. Years of emotional turmoil had taken an enormous toll on Sheppard's physical and mental health. His struggles with alcoholism continued even as his wrestling career gained momentum. During the brief 6 months they were married, his wife later stated that Sam consumed nearly 1.5 liters of liquor every day. On April 6, 1970, less than a year after making his professional wrestling debut, Sam Sheppard died at just 46 years old. His death was initially believed to have been caused by liver failure. Later, the official cause was determined to be Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, a severe neurological disorder commonly associated with chronic alcohol abuse. Although his wrestling career lasted only a matter of months, it left behind a surprising legacy that would outlive him by decades. Drawing upon his background as a neurosurgeon, Sheppard developed an unusual submission hold that relied on anatomical pressure points rather than brute strength. He called it the mandibular nerve pinch. The maneuver involved sliding 2 fingers beneath an opponent's tongue while using the palm of the hand to force the lower jaw upward, applying pressure to sensitive nerves and soft tissue. Whether or not the hold could produce the effects Sheppard claimed, it was unlike anything else being used in professional wrestling at the time. Years later, legendary wrestling manager and wrestling historian Jim Cornette suggested the maneuver to Mick Foley, who adapted it into the now famous mandible claw. As Mankind, Foley transformed the move into one of the signature finishing holds of the Attitude Era, introducing it to millions of wrestling fans who had no idea its origins traced back to a disgraced neurosurgeon from Ohio. After Cornette taught Foley the hold, he pitched it to legendary promoter Cowboy Bill Watts. Watts' response was blunt: "Why don't I just bite your fingers off?" Foley received a similar reaction when he pitched the idea to Vince McMahon. This time, however, Foley had an answer. He explained that it was a nerve hold, using pressure beneath the tongue and along the jaw to immobilize an opponent. McMahon was convinced, and the rest is history. Even after Sam Sheppard's death, the mystery surrounding Marilyn's murder refused to disappear. Sam's son, Sam Jr., spent years trying to clear his father's name and find the person he believed was responsible for his mother's death. His investigation eventually led him to Richard Eberling, a mentally disturbed man who had once worked around the Sheppard family home and was later imprisoned for the murder of an elderly woman. When Sam Jr. confronted Eberling, he denied killing Marilyn. But he did something that immediately raised questions. He drew an extraordinarily detailed map of the Sheppard home, including a little-known entrance to the basement. Sam Jr. and Cleveland attorney Terry Gilbert continued investigating. They eventually uncovered sealed police records showing that Eberling had been arrested for burglary several years after Marilyn's murder. More suspiciously, 2 of Marilyn's rings were later discovered in his possession. In 1997, Sam Jr. and Gilbert filed a civil lawsuit against Cuyahoga County, arguing that his father had been wrongfully imprisoned. Eberling died in prison the following year, but despite the evidence presented by Sam Jr., the jury ultimately rejected his claims. In the end, the story of Sam Sheppard is not a simple story of a murderer, an innocent man, or even a professional wrestler.